Alright, there we go. Live on there. Yep, broadcasting. Alright. So that is up and running. Link's been shared out to a couple of different spots. Alright. Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins Truergy, also known in various places online as Byron of Sidious. I have said on many occasions that I have for a long time been a hobbyist in the video game arena. A lot of the shows that I've been, live stream shows that I've been watching the last year, a little bit more than that, have been focused on and centered around the video game industry and journalism and reviews and critiques and coverage thereof. Because I've been playing games since the days of the Atari 2600, where all you had was a big old joystick with a single orange rounded button to press for your input and for interaction with the game proper, I've got a long history of indulging in these electronic stories and pastimes. Generally speaking, I have indulged in nerd and geek culture pretty much since I was a little kid. But in the current environment of media and entertainment, video games have come to the forefront as the primary earner in terms of just raw money, raw dollars, and earning potential. However, many of these games are also expensive to produce because you're having to invest in new technologies, you're having to invest in programmers and developers, you're having to invest in voice actors, motion capture technology, what have you. There's a lot that goes into uh, programming, developing, and publishing, distributing a game. Distribution is no longer as physically intensive as it used to be. Back when I was growing up, your games came on cartridges, and those cartridges, a physical plastic shell with a chipboard with programmed diodes and contact and connectors that would click into a system, so that the contactors would connect. When you turned on the system then read the cartridge, read the boards that were pressed up against the internal connectors, so that that game, that programming, would feed through the system. And whatever controller you had, whatever your interaction device of choice or necessity was, it was pre-programmed with certain function inputs to respond in the game in a very specific way. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm not a programmer. The terminology is going to escape me sometimes. I apologize. Regardless, the evolution of video games has been something marvelous to watch over the years. And distribution, as I was talking about, with a physical cartridge, that cartridge has to go into some kind of container, a box, a case, what have you. And then those games and those packages need to be sent to physical brick and mortar retailers. This was how it was done back in the day. And those retailers were responsible for making available for sale those games. Fast forward to the age of disc-based games. Well, you still needed to format that disc. You had to get the data transferred from the programmers, from the computers to those discs. Coding had to be put on those discs to protect them from being copied straight from the disk to some other exterior memory storage device or unit, so that only with that disk could the game be played in a specific system, whether it be the PlayStation, the Sega CD, the Dreamcast, the Saturn, Xbox, blah, 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 etc., etc. Neo Geo. Depends on how exotic you want to get with your systems and what you were able to play and access back, throughout your own lifetime. Fast forward again to today, where distribution of a game can almost entirely be handled through an internet connection, where there is no physical game, where it's entirely a digital download purchase. I say purchase, though certain companies, most of them nowadays, have started to play fast and loose with their definition of the term purchase when it comes to video games, thanks to folks like Ubisoft. Players need to get comfortable with the idea that they don't own their games. Well, you need to get comfortable with the idea that we're not going to buy your shit anymore. Thanks, no, you don't get my money. The need for packaging is largely gone. Instruction manuals or booklets, forget about it. The only way you're going to get something like that is if you order a special limited edition steel book or something of that nature, where that's going to be included. And it wasn't that long ago that we had actual cases with a physical copy of the game in the case. It came with a manual. The manual will give you snippets of story. It would give you, text-based with image tutorials and instructions on how to play the game. It was called an instruction manual. Nowadays, if you want to get something that has an actual physical case with an actual physical copy of the game that you can access and play in your system whenever you so choose without an internet connection, best of fucking luck. Largely not going to happen. But I digress. This is not intended to be an examination of video games or movies or television shows in digital media format versus physical format. That's a topic that I've touched upon briefly before and possibly will touch upon again in a future video or stream. I did an essay a couple of years ago for the Howard Bloom Institute regarding that subject matter. I wasn't as diehard in favor or preferential to physical media at that time. I have become more and more adamant, however, about the importance and vitality of having a physical copy of whatever it is that you intend to indulge in your leisure or downtime. What I am here primarily to talk about today is, well, just look at the title of the stream. Left, right, conservative, progressive, just let us play games. I'm going to deploy a visual tool to assist in illustrating what I'm talking about. Yeah, just a simple little dry erase board. Over here, amongst the potential folks involved in any way with video games, whether they be people playing video games, whether they be the people who are making the video games, or they be the people who are covering the video games industry. Okay? I think it's fair to say that if you were to take a sample of a fairly broad swath of people who are involved in video games in any of these areas, as the buyers and players, as the programmers and makers and publishers, or as the people covering or talking about video games, whether they be established traditional journalists and reporters, or they be independent content creators on YouTube and Rumble and elsewhere who are covering various video games. I count them as part of the coverage set. So there's folks playing the games, folks making the games, and the folks covering the games. This trifecta, or triforce, if you will. I would say that they probably are fairly representative of the general public writ large. You're going to have people involved in each of these three areas who are fairly diverse in their political viewpoints and socio-political opinions, fairly representative of the public in terms of sex, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of faith background, though I will point out, I will posit, and this is something that people will say might seem culturally insensitive. I don't care. I'm observing reality. There's a reason why you don't see a whole hell of a lot of folks who are self-described Muslims involved in the development of video games. It is largely because many faith leaders in Islam find it to be a form of idolatry, and that it leads to laziness and corruption of the spirit. Now, I think that's fairly laughable from a group of people who also think that if you speak ill of their prophet, that you should have your head fucking removed from your shoulders. But we're not exactly dealing with the most nuanced group of thinkers when you get into the diehards of any faith. Because I could also point to folks like John Delarose, who is seems to me like he's trying to lean into this diehard, almost fundamentalist Christian cloak in an effort to dominate everybody's favorite pastime in this area, video games. Now, being that I think there's a relatively fair distribution as far as folks being somewhat representative in their percentages and saturation in the realms of video game industry as players, makers, and coverers of games. Because it's fairly representative, I think it's also logical to imagine that the same concentrations can be found in that industry as are found in the broader society writ large. And here in the Western world, I would say that this is my estimation of the breakdown of folks involved in gaming. Over here, you've got the fringe left, progressive left, tolerant left, wokies. I would estimate probably represent about 15% of the entire populace of folks involved in video games. Over here, I would say you've probably got the fringe right holy rollers, like Melanie Mack and JDA and John F. Trent and Razorfist. I would say they probably also only represent about 15% of the total populace of people in the distribution of gamers. And there's this great big middle portion. 70% is the rest of us. Okay? I would say that that's probably, just using kind of a broad brush or using my own senses and capacity for, I don't know, observing reality, I would say that's a fair, if not giving a little bit more credit to how many people are on the fringe left and fringe right, I'd say that's a relatively fair estimation. You've got 15% on the far right, 15% on the far left, and the rest of us caught in the middle and leaning one way or the other. All right? For what seems like a very long time, about the last 15 years, the folks in that 15% on the fringe wokey side have been infecting every vector of entertainment that they can and pushing their ideology, cramming it into every crevasse they can find, especially in terms of the concentration of folks in the development and programming arena. And they have been demanding that folks who make video games insert their socio-political ideology and messaging into those games so that their ideas, their messages, can be carried out to the rest of the entirety of the video game public. Folks who play games or cover games or make games. They have demanded this through cancellation attempts, through boycott attempts, through subtly, quietly inserting members of their own ideological cult into the industry itself proper, getting them into positions of power and authority, either through means of getting them hired on into studios to work as programmers, as developers, or they've worked their way into the various financiers who pay for these games to be made so that they can hold the money necessary for the production and development of video games hostage in the event that a developer or programmer group decides they don't want to instantiate their socio-political ideological messaging into that game. They can say, oh, hold up. If you don't do it, we're not going to give you the funding that you need. They hold your funding ransom. The folks over at Gothic Therapy have done a fantastic job really diving down into this element of how the fringe left have uh, invaded or infiltrated the industry of video games through funding sources, through controlling the purse strings. Since about 2010, they've been doing this in film, they've been doing this in television, and they've been doing this in video games. I will move on to my next point in a minute. I have to run up real quick and use the restroom. Back in a moment. So let me put on some music really quick so that you're not sitting here in dead air. Oh, come on. Back in a minute. They say we don't care, we're writing lost cause. Blame us with the drama, pointing out a lot of flaws. But I love this soil, these mountains extremes. The flag ain't the problem, it's the folks with the schemes. True to the land, not the men on the throne. This country's hard, it's the people not so. It's the dirty hands that keep us in chains. Who will rise for the land that can never profane. Don't need a suit to show what I'm worth. My roots run deep in this patch of earth. They have to live money because I'm humbly. I'm shot for the people, not bureaucracy. True to the land, not the men on the throne. This country's hard, it's the people not so. It's the dirty hands that keep us in chains. Who will rise for the land that can never profane. Don't need a suit to show what I'm worth. My roots run deep in this patch of earth. The anthem they play, the monopoly. I'll shout for the people, not bureaucracy. True to the land, the men on the throne. This country's hard, it's the people not so. It's the dirty hands that keep us in chains. Who will rise for the land they can never profane. The stripes and the stars, they belong to us all. Not the fat cats parading in grand marble halls. With the sweat and the struggle, the fire and flames. They don't own our patriot hearts or our names. They say questioning them makes loyalty weak. But I see through the lies, they refuse to critique. A landlord's fighting isn't no man's throne. It's the hands of the workers. It's what we all own. It's what we all own. Don't need a suit to show what I'm worth. My roots run deep in this patch of earth. The anthem they play ain't their monopoly. I'll shout for the people, not bureaucracy. True to the land, the men on the throne. This country's hard, it's the people not so. It's the dirty hands that keep us in chains. Who will rise for the land that can never profane. We don't want rules for fame. Okay. So, since about 2010, as I was saying before I headed up to use the restroom, the folks on the ideological left, quote unquote, as it were, the wokies, have been insisting on getting their way into every avenue of escapism that we have available to us in the modern era. Now, they'd been doing this sort of thing in publishing and genre fiction for a very long time. But here's a big part of the reason that they were able to do it and nobody really made a big fuss about it in genre fiction, in fantasy, sci-fi, and horror, is largely because the publishing industry has been one of the slowest moving industries in terms of entertainment since its inception. It's been around forever compared to many of the other forms of media and entertainment. And there's such a broad availability of what's potentially out there that it was not seen as a big problem. If somebody wanted to write a story wherein the main character was we're going to go ahead and use the reductio ad absurdum example, a gay black trans woman in a wheelchair, nobody cared, especially not the folks who are reading fantasy, sci-fi, and horror. They typically would have looked at something like that and just gone, okay, what's the plot? Does this make sense for the narrative? Does it make sense for this character? Is the character well written? It wasn't an immediate throwing up of, oh, what the hell? In large part because if there was messaging, that socio-political and ideological messaging that came through the actual text and it was blatant and obvious, those books or those stories flopped. They failed to launch. They didn't get an audience. And no one gave a shit when the author of that particular work was forgotten and left in the dustbin of history. It wasn't as big an impact. However, the folks in the fringe left finally figured out where they were going wrong. They were trying to worm their way into genre fiction and publishing as authors. And they eventually figured out, well, wait, if we can fill the ranks of all of the literary agencies and the distribution warehouses and book distributors like Bowker and Baker and Taylor, if we can fill the positions at the acquisitions departments inside the publishing houses, if we can fill all the roles of the editorial departments, we will control who gets to tell their story. And they'll only be allowed to tell their story if it aligns with our perceptions of how reality should be, the way we want it to be. The artists were choked out. It's why there's such a hullabaloo over this independent small press outlet that I think it was about a month ago that I read about, where this publisher, it's a small UK-based indie press, led and inspired by a lone author at first, saying that he wanted to start his own publishing house that would focus on publishing the works of white male, or not even white, just male authors, because so much of the marketplace is only female authors. Look at the shelves in a fantasy section in a bookstore. You're only going to find mostly female authors, mostly romantasy, which is this weird cringe hybrid of romance and fantasy that focuses on titillation more than actual plot or character development. A lot of it's garbage. I've talked about this before. Anyway, back to video games. Sorry, I keep going off into tangents. At first, when there was pushback against this ideological hammering over everybody's head in our entertainment, I would say one of the biggest opening pushbacks came from the 2016 Ghostbusters reboot. Or not even reboot, but the all-female Ghostbusters adaptation. It did not do well. It didn't perform well in theaters at the box office. It didn't review well amongst folks who were known as cinema critics and fans, particularly in the small press or indie content creator arena. Sure, the folks at traditional outlets like newspapers, magazines, and well-funded online, highly credentialed outlets praised it and lavished all kinds of adoration upon the film. But the folks who are actually sitting their asses in the seats as common everyday people looked at it and said, this was shit. How could you like this? They turned to the critics and asked them broadly, how could you like this? How can you defend this? This is nonsense. It's terrible. And those people, the common, average, everyday public person, was told, shut your mouth, pleb. We're the experts. We know what we're talking about. We have attained these prestigious positions as critics and content and journalists covering this industry. What do you know? Well, they know what they like, and they know what they don't like, and they didn't like this shit. And they told you they didn't like this shit. And what was the response to that? From the industry. To basically call them a bunch of bigots, call them sexists, call them racists, every ist and phobe and phobophobe label got slapped at the general public, who said, this was terrible. I didn't like it. You're pushing a message on us. And it didn't get any better from there, because we started noticing it cropping up in video games. And you don't want to try to sneak something past a group of people whose hobby for years has heavily depended upon pattern recognition. For anyone who's an older video game player, perhaps you will recognize this. I'm going to go ahead and draw something here. And the layout will be familiar to the old heads amongst you. What's this? Gold star for anybody who can just come up with an idea of. I mean, I'm no visual artist. Sorry, I'm not. This is representative of the stage select screen for almost every Mega Man game that was put out on the Nintendo by Capcom, and ultimately in Mega Man X, the Super Nintendo, Game Boy, whatever systems it shows up on. The Mega Man series has a fairly recognizable stage select screen. And you go from one robot master to another, and you try to figure out which weapons that are obtained from defeating one robot master are going to effectively hit the weak spot for another robot master. Or, failing that, when you're first starting the game and you don't have any of those extra weapons, there's going to be one or two of these robot master bosses who, at the end of their stage, while you may not have access at that point to the weapon that hits their weak spot, they operate in such a blatant and obvious and easy to exploit pattern of attacks and movements that the player can effectively defeat them without having to worry about having the weapon that corresponds to their weakness. And that gets them their first sub-weapon that they can then use to hop over to whichever other robot master is weak to that weapon, and then exploit that weakness, and move on to the third robot master who is weak to the second robot master's weapon, exploiting that weakness, doing kind of a domino effect, and effectively wiping them out quickly, which has always kind of confused me when in the Wily Manor, I think it was since Mega Man 3, where one of the Wily Manor or Wily Castle levels is a boss rush mode where you go into this central chamber and there's a little like teleporter pod, 8 of them, one corresponding to each of the bosses who you've already bested. It instantly teleports you into a combat chamber to fight that robot master who you've already bested. But now you have all of the sub-weapons. It's just a matter of reminding yourself, oh, which one did I use to kill this guy quick? All right. And you whip right through them. Anyway, the point being, people who play video games typically are pretty good at pattern recognition. When something repeats itself over and over again, we pick up on it relatively quickly. Why? Because we indulge in a hobby and pastime that rewards us for recognizing enemy behavior and patterns in the environment that we can leverage to our own benefit and reward. So it really confuses me how anybody in the fringe ideological left in the Western world could have possibly thought that they'd be able to continue carrying on the way that they have infinitely. You won't. It was never going to be a matter of you being able to do this forever. Because there's enough people in the center, in that center 70%, or who might even be in that fringe right 15%, who are going to say, stop what you're doing. I see what you're doing. Knock it the fuck off. Now, for years, you had these fringe left loons screaming and howling at all the people down here who just wanted to play games. Okay? You're screaming and howling at them, respect my pronouns! Let's face it, it's what a lot of it came down to, was people demanding that the folks who are actually paying for the games suck up and bow down and kowtow to the ideology, of these freaks. And I say freaks because at this point I'm done being polite about it. And eventually, finally, in the last couple of years, there's been some pushback against it. From the people buying and playing the games. They finally recognized, hey, wait a minute. If we don't buy this shit, the people who make the games are going to start raising the skeptical hippo eyebrow at this group of fringe nutcases, many of whom don't even play the games themselves. They come from the developers, or more often than not, they come from that section of people who are covering games. They come from Twitter. They come from Kotaku. They come from Polygon. They come from, recently, Rolling Stone, thanks to Alyssa Mercante. They come from places and outlets that don't actually buy the games or pay for them or pay for the development of them. They come from the people who are talking about them in the public discourse with the backing of large media conglomerates and outlets that seem to lend some sense of credibility, but in reality, they're no more credible than you or I. I'm willing to bet at some point someone either watching this stream live or watches it later on in playback would be able to tell me or tell everyone who looks through the comments what one of their fondest memories of playing video games was from their childhood or from their teenage years. If they're an adult like myself and they still play video games here and there, I don't play as often as I would when I was younger, but I've got kids, I've got bills to pay, I've got other pursuits, I still write, and I read a ton. So there's not so much me in that talking about, people who are adults who play video games, but think about people like Hypnotic, people like Smash JT, people like Jay Viper, okay? Folks who play a lot of video games, or at least as much as they can, given their other obligations, but they're not in the journalism industry, quote unquote, covering video games. They are independent voices who are trying to give their authentic take, their sincere take on these games. And that is what's lacking from people like Alyssa Mercante. It's actually what I personally find to be lacking from people like John F. Trent and John Delarose from Fandom Pulse. They like to excoriate these games if they're, quote, woke enough to deserve it. But there's a part of me that just doesn't take them seriously. I don't feel like they're being sincere in their perception of things. But we'll get to them. They're not part of the fringe wokey lunatics. That territory belongs solidly to folks like Mercante and the folks at Kotaku and Polygon and IGN, who's one of the biggest bandito groups out there in terms of trying to push an agenda. I blame folks like the people at IGN almost exclusively for the absolute knife in the kidney murder of the Dragon Age franchise. That's a sidebar. I'll come back to that in a minute. But anyway, we're finally starting to get some pushback against these folks from the people who are actually, buying and playing the games, which reduced the size, scope, and nastiness of the fringe lefties and left some breathing room for those of us who are just trying to play games. And we were happy. We celebrated. We went, hooray! Some breathing room. Awesome. Because games like Dragon Age the Veilguard flopped. Games like Concord flopped. Games that had an overbearing, hammer-fisted, ham-handed approach to pushing an ideological agenda finally started flopping, started failing. Games like Dustborn were left to rot in the bargain bin. These developers, these companies were told, we don't want that slop because we're not here to be lectured at or preached to about how we need to increase the equity in the world. By the way, for the folks who are pushing the whole DEI thing, the equity portion of that expression, the only place where you will find true equity in the world is the cemetery, because it's the only time where we all end up naturally at the same finish line. We all are dead at the end, and we're in the ground, we're planted there. It's the only place you will find true equity in nature, is once you're dead. Because any other attempt at quote-unquote equity requires the application of force, policy, or cultural indoctrination in order to push an equivalent result. People are different. We're varied. It's part of what makes humanity beautiful, is that we are so godforsaken weird, each and every one of us. All right? Okay. So the gamers, the people paying for, buying, and playing the video games, they finally had some breathing room. Okay? Right in here. Finally had some breathing room. And that's when we enter what has been colloquially referred to as Goonergate, thanks to The Last Descendant and Stellar Blade and games like that. It's where we saw folks like Melanie Mack and Razorfist and John Delarose, John F. Trent decide this was their opportunity, that they were going to now enter the scene. And now they were going to try and step into that gap of breathing room. Now they were going to start lecturing the gamers. Now it was their opportunity to push their agenda and their ideology and their perception of how things should be. Just one problem. I'm old enough to remember the Satanic Panic. I'm old enough to remember how many different hearings there were on Capitol Hill in the Senate about video games corrupting the youth of the day. I remember people standing up and giving testimony about the fatalities in Mortal Kombat at the arcade and on the Sega Genesis, and how on the Super Nintendo you could activate the bloody and gory fatalities if you entered a specific cheat code on your controller. I remember them getting pissed off at the folks at Nintendo Power for publishing an article, or it was like a 2-page explanation, telling players who subscribed to Nintendo Power or picked up the magazine at the grocery store or at the newsstand, wherever they would purchase it, there was a 2-page spread explaining how to unlock the gore mode in the SNES version of Mortal Kombat. And people flipped their shit. The ESRB, the Electronic Safety Ratings Board, was born out of this moralizing push to command and control what people were allowed to access in their entertainment, especially in video games. I remember that. I lived through it. I played video games through it. So then when you have folks like JDA, like Razorfist, like Melanie Mack, stepping into that small gap that the 70% of us in the middle finally managed to get by pushing back against the fringe left woke idiots and ideologues. We finally had some breathing room and could be hopeful that maybe some developers and programmers in the video games industry were going to start listening to people who just wanted games that were good, who just wanted to have something fun or engaging and thought-provoking. Okay? Because not every game has to be Doom. Not every game has to be a complete adrenaline dump, just push buttons, rip and tear. I love that. Sometimes that's what I'm going after, but not always. There are other times where I actually want a well thought out narrative with characters who I can actually, identify with on an intellectual level. Characters like Yuri from the Shadow Hearts games, brilliant RPGs. If you've never played them, you're missing out. And though it would be expensive, if you've got the money, I cannot recommend enough going and purchasing, if you don't already have one, an original PlayStation 2 piece of hardware, and then go and find a copy of Shadow Hearts and Shadow Hearts Covenant. From the New World was okay, not the greatest sequel, but it was okay. What a bit of I played, because I didn't finish it. I got to admit that. Cards on the table. I didn't finish the third Shadow Hearts game. Sorry. If you want to go back further than that, you got to get on PlayStation 1 and grab a copy of Kudelka, because that was really the first game in that series, as it were. I'm, again, going off on a tangent. My point being, to the folks who I've already name dropped here, and to anyone and everyone who sympathizes with that perspective, don't think for a moment that I personally have a grudge against you just because you are Christian. Okay? I'm very sympathetic to your faith-based cause, in large part because, though I am not a good one, I too am a Christian man. I'm just not a very good one. Okay? I'm willing to admit that. But I'm also not here looking for your fucking guidance. All right? The moral majority from the Reaganite Bush Sr. era of the 1980s and early 90s needs to fuck off. We left them in the past for a reason. They lost cultural relevance for a reason. You know why? Because they couldn't pull their heads out of their arses long enough to recognize that the world they lived in would not bow to them and shouldn't have had to. Because that is a world where you only get to choose how you're going to bow and scrape to your masters. Fuck that. Not very Christ-like of you to demand obeisance when you yourself are just people. Judgment is supposed to be reserved for God alone, not for people like John De La Rose or his publisher, Vox Day, which, by the way, has anybody stopped to poke at him and point out that calling yourself the voice of God, but making wordplay out of that Latin expression could be seen by some people as, I don't know, blasphemous? Especially when you're doing it in order to aggrandize yourself? Seems a little hypocritical, buddy. Just saying. The 70% of us in the middle area, from what I was showing before, when we were able to push the fringe left wokies back, that was not an invitation to the holy roller fuckers like Melanie Mack and John De La Rose and Razor Fist and John F. Trent to come in and try and swing their culture warhammer into our faces and demand that we bow. No. It wasn't an invitation. It was a breath of relief. It was a, oh, thank God. And you guys heard God and thought, oh, they want us now. They want us to take over and take control. You will do this, X, Y, Z. No, get the fuck out of here. Left, right, conservative, progressive. We just want to play video games. We just want to read fantasy. We just want to watch Star Wars without having somebody shove a non-binary Middle Eastern refugee with two gender-bent parents that's missing an arm, and oh, by the way, aren't they so stunning and fucking brave? Tell us that we need to give them all of our earned wealth and belongings and spaces and privileges just because they are the way they are. No, fuck that. And fuck you for insisting on it. There's a reason we said get out. And anyone who decides to take that as an open invitation to then come in and try to stand on the bully pulpit that we just kicked the last tyrant off of in order to push their nonsense on us, we're going to tell them also, get out. That is a big part of the reason why there was such a hostile blowback and pushback against the folks at Fandom Pulse and John De La Rose and Razor Fist and Melanie Mack and all of their ilk. There was such a ferocious pushback against them because we just got done getting some fucking breathing room from the woke idiots. We just got done, and they're still pushing in on us. So in that small gap of breathing room, you dolts thought it would be a good idea to jump in and demand that we get behind you and obey you and follow your orders? Get bent. We're not here for that. John Delarose, JDA, made it an ass of himself again not too long ago. Atreus covered it, wherein there were some DMs that were exposed or shared out there. I don't remember who did the sharing of them, but it was an exchange between Smash JT and JDA, wherein Delarose attempted a Kafka trap, a linguistic Kafka trap on him, saying, well, if you're against the woke, then are you okay with developers and game makers pushing trans ideology and propaganda into video games? And Smash JT's response was, I think they should be allowed to push whatever messaging they want. They should be allowed to. But I am allowed to call it for what it is and to say I'm not going to support it by not buying it. That is the perfect argument, because it does exactly represent the 70% of people involved in video games, whether they be as players, developers, or people who are talking about and covering the video games industry and hobby in general. That's where most of us stand. It's where most of us are at. We don't want an ideology pushed from either of the fringes down our throats. It's not welcome. If you're going to indulge in messaging through your art, it should be done subtly. It should be done artfully, without being ham-fisted and obvious. There's a book by a woman by the name of Annalee Newitz called Autonomous. The first about 100 pages, it's a really fascinating science fiction story set in the near future and developing the concept of fully sentient automatons, hence the name of the story, Autonomous. It touches upon and dabbles in the area of androids with consciousness, fully self-aware AI. And for those first 100 pages, it's a fairly fascinating read. But beyond that point, it quickly devolves into the use of characters and plot devices and events in the overall run of the story's overarching world-building plot. It devolves quickly into a kind of left-wing feminist screed on the part of Miss Newitz that was so ham-fisted and so blatant and so holier than thou, I ended up struggling to get through the rest of the book and finish reading it. And the notes that I did a review, I took notes and did a review on it about 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. And I tore that book apart. I highlighted each instance, each scene where there was blatant and obvious fringe left liberal or progressive messaging in the characters' dialogue, actions, or the exposition put forth by Miss Newitz in the third person form. It was so overt, it took my enjoyment, my potential enjoyment of the material, and threw it under the bus. After that first 100 pages or so, she no longer cared about continuing to tell an engaging story and developing these characters. They became kind of rote, wooden mokujin, whose only purpose was to fill an archetypal or stereotypal role, Stereotypes exist for a reason, especially in storytelling. When you've got a throwaway character who you're only going to use once or they don't really matter to the overall plot, you can employ a stereotypes just so that you can get through a scene. But when your primary character, your primary protagonist, or Lancer, your secondary protagonist, is little more than a walking archetype that borders on stereotype, I no longer care about that character. And when the world building you've established to this point has had a vaguely noticeable message or socio-political bent to it, where I'm kind of left like going, maybe this is what she's getting at, but I'm going to leave it go for now because I'm enjoying the story. When that ramps up and becomes blatant as well, then I'm completely out and I no longer care about this story. The only thing that could have been a saving grace, and quite possibly the only reason I ended up finishing that book, was because it was well written. I'll give her that. Annalee Newitz's command of the English language and her ability to carry you through a sequence of events in a tight time frame window is superb. She's talented that way. But I no longer want to read anything else that woman ever puts out for the rest of time. This was her premiere novel. She had done a lot of work writing for IO9 and for Popular Mechanics and a couple of other tech-related magazines and journals online. So she had a background in tech, hence why she felt it was natural as a fit to write a science fiction story. Makes sense. It's just too bad that her ideological bent bled through into her storytelling so blatantly. Now, that is just, again, it's an example of if you are going to be that ham-fisted and over the top, why should anybody care? Most of us who are in that middle 70% bracket, it's not what we're after. And now I am finally going to get back to Dragon Age. I said I would talk about that more at some point in this stream. Dragon Age Inquisition is a 10-year-old game. Been out for a long time, comparatively. It's an older title. And though there are plenty of folks who will give me shit for saying this, of the first 3 Dragon Age games, Inquisition was my favorite. I personally thought it had the best cast and it had a great story in terms of world building. Primary antagonist, not so much. Corypheus was a little bit of a miss. I will grant you that. I thought they really could have done better than him. But the world building was top notch. And there were a number of different sideline kind of subquests or side quests that contributed to a greater whole that made Thedas, as presented in Inquisition, an engrossing and engaging world to play within. The characters that were primarily focused upon were by and large done very well, I felt. There's one character, and I've talked about this before, so some of you may know where I'm going with this. There is a character by the name of Cremesius Aclassi, the lieutenant serving under Iron Bull, who is a recruitable character for your party, and a mercenary. He is a Kunari leader of a mercenary band known as the Bull's Chargers. His lieutenant is a fellow by the name of Cremesius Aclassi, who is a Tevinter-born native who hates Tevinter. If you engage in and indulge in private conversations with Iron Bull at your home base in Haven routinely, and you develop your one-on-one relationship with him and connection to him, and then continue those dialogues, those side quest dialogues with him when you get to Skyhold after the first fifth of the game, I'd say, you can eventually unlock a sequence in the pub at Skyhold wherein Iron Bull is sat with his chargers, drinking, having some laughs, just taking their leisure. And your player character, the Inquisitor, through these dialogues, can come across the sequence wherein Iron Bull is complaining about the cold up in Skyhold, and Krem asks Bull if he or tells Bull if he ever needs any help wrapping his pillowy man bosoms, that he can give him pointers, indicating that Krem knows very well about chest binding. Krem is transgender in this game. In Tevinter, according to the history developed by the folks at EA, Tevinter did not smile upon people like that. They considered them freaks and outcasts and weirdos. But they also considered them citizens of Tevinter and didn't punish them for it culturally, or rather legally. They just kind of frowned upon them and looked at them as weird, degenerate. But they didn't punish them, not through criminal action, or through prosecution of any kind. What they frowned upon Krem for, though, was the fact that Krem's family were not magic users. They weren't mages. And as such, they were considered lower second-class citizens. Because in the Tevinter Imperium, magic rules all. Krem's father was a tailor. He was a master tailor. Krem, I'm not going to dive into all of the specifics of Cremisius's background or backstory. There are short stories that you can find online that detail, and this is canon material. This is stuff that's considered officially part of Dragon Age lore and history. The Inquisitor has a number of options in dialogue to react to this revelation that Krem is a woman living as a man. And one of the options that the Inquisitor has in dialogue with Iron Bull is to ask Bull, like, well, what's is that what's going on there? And Bull says, well, Cremisius is what we would call in the Cune an acunithlock, which is someone born as one sex, living as the other. And Cremisius asks, and says they don't have a problem with that. They don't treat us different than any other. They wouldn't treat me different than any other man. And Bull says, of course not, because they are men. It's very heavy-handed the way he says it and delivers that line. However, in the context of the Dragon Age and Thedas lore, it makes sense for the people of the Cune living under the Cune, which is a kind of communist dictatorship hellscape, wherein you are not a person, you are your role, you are your job. All right? Bull's real name means liar in the Qun because he's a spy. He doesn't have a real name. He has a job role. In any kind of societal framework where you are completely defined by what you can do for the collective, of course they're not going to care if somebody pretends to be a man when they were born a woman or pretends to be a woman when they were born a man. The powers that be under the Qun don't give a shit about that. They just want you to do your job for the benefit of the collective. Everything else is gravy to them. They don't care. Kind of like in the real world, where these fringe lefty commie types seem to not really give a shit how you identify as long as you support their redistribution of wealth nonsense and horse shit. Anyway, I digress. The point I'm trying to put across is, in Dragon Age Inquisition, this socio-political or personal trait about Krem is actually portrayed pretty well. It's not jarring. It doesn't take me out of the game. It doesn't take me out of the experience for a couple of reasons. For one, it's an optional side quest dialogue. You as the player have to do an awful lot of your own volition to get to that point, for that to even become a factor. So yes, it is something that JDA and Fandom Pulse would say is woke. Whoa, whoa, spooky language to quote George Carlin. I'm generally not, I'm not exactly going to support that lifestyle or that path through life. But I'm also not going to say, oh, well, this is obvious, messaging of degeneracy and they want the players to be okay with this. No. You're so steeped in the lore of that fictional realm at that point that hopefully you've got enough brain cells to rub together to recognize this is just part of a story. All right? And you, as the player, had to make personal decisions of your own choosing and volition to get to that point where that was revealed. As opposed to, in Dragon Age, the Veilguard, Tasha's, I'm non-binary. You have to come past that scene in order to play through the entirety of the game. It is an essential component of the story progression. You can't avoid it. You can't skip it. It's there. There's no other path to avoid it. That happens. So rather than having a potential subtle piece of messaging that takes up almost zero time and does not impact the primary cast of the story, that does not impact your ability to progress through the game, as in Dragon Age Inquisition, versus this is a primary character in your party. You have no way to skip or avoid this. It does impact their behavior and your main character's behavior and interactions between the other principal cast members of the story. It does have an effect on the overarching storyline, and suck it up or don't play the game. Pretty different. Vastly different circumstances. One is clearly identifiably trying to shove its message down your throat. The other is a potential side quest interaction that affects nothing. So I think of the folks over at Fandom Pulse. If they want to exercise any kind of journalistic integrity or try to claim that they are that they're working on behalf of gamers, they would have pointed this differentiation out at some point. But they didn't. Why? Because that's not going to sell subscriptions on their Substack or their website. It's disingenuous at best. Then again, I've come to expect little else from folks who support John Delarose. Now, do I think that games like Veilguard should not exist? No. They can exist. They can be on the market. By all means. If you want to make a game as a developer and throw it out there with that kind of heavy-handed slop, have at it, Hoss. I'm not going to buy the game. I'm not going to praise it. I'm not going to lie about it and say that it's a brilliant piece of art. But I did see video gameplay from that game on a couple of different streams, and I will say that the visual aesthetics I thought were okay, especially the environmental backgrounds, very skillfully rendered into the game. Seriously, the environments in Veilguard looked gorgeous. I can't take that away from the finished product. Just, you got to ask yourself, are those pretty backgrounds worth the cost of entry and getting slammed over the head with this ideological cudgel? No. Not worth the price of entry. We just want to play video games. We don't want to have hollering and screaming and cajoling from either of these fuckers. Okay? The Holy Rollers and the Fringe Wokies, none of you are welcome to try shoving your shit down my neck. Even if I have empathy or sympathy towards your perspective. As I said, I'm not unsympathetic to the Christian message. I am a Christian. But that doesn't mean that I want that to be the only thing that determines what's going to be in a story. We're talking about fiction here, folks. Have you never heard the expression, you draw more flies with honey than vinegar? Or has that piece of mythical wisdom been forgotten, cast aside? Because you're pursuing clicks and you're chasing down subscriptions, hoping to make a payday at the end of it all. You know, the fringe left, they have failed to recognize that it doesn't matter how many people hop on X or Twitter or nowadays Blue Sky and scream to the high heavens, this is wonderful and should be praised. Go, yes, Slay Queen, you go, girl boss. He, him, Caesar, them. That doesn't matter if they don't actually buy the goddamn product. All right? If you can't make the damn thing or continue it or make a sequel if you've got no financial backing. And no offense, but from everything I've seen from Publishers Weekly and from Nielsen Bookscan, the folks who do the most piracy, who engage in it in terms of films and games and books and comics, are college-educated, middle-aged people. Okay? The very same crowd that the wokies are constantly trying to pull in, they're the ones who aren't going to pay for your shit. They're going to steal it. Whereas the folks who are slightly more conservative, or who classify themselves as right-leaning or libertarian, if they actually support your product, they're going to buy it. They'll spend their money on it. They'll say, you know what? I appreciate and endorse the message that you've got coming across here, or there's no messaging at all and it's just something that I enjoy. Kudos to you. Good on you, brother. I'm going to buy your product. And they pay for it. They pay their hard-earned, honestly earned money so that they can exchange it for the thing that they want. and that they want to see more of. How do you think there were? Why do you think there were so many terrible schlocky slasher horror films in the 80s and 90s? They kept making money. Yes, it was brainless drivel, a lot of it. Friday the 13th films, I'm sorry, they had no business going beyond maybe the second or third movie. I liked them, but I liked them for what they were. Hokey, schlocky horror shit. Okay? It was cheaply made, but I enjoyed it, so I kept buying it. And they kept making it, because there was an audience. Oh, what do we got here? No, okay. Okay, that's interesting. I'll have to dive into that. Hold on one tick there, folks. You gotta see what the hell exactly is. Hmm. Ugh, of course. Yeah, that's a whole other thing for another day. More nonsense on Substack. But not what I'm here for today. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up. Just final thoughts here for me. Part of the reason, a big part of the reason, why the folks who consider themselves to be, to quote John De La Rose again, who claims consistently that he is under attack because he's a Christian right wing conservative. No, dude. You're under pushback because nobody wants you to be their lecturer. No one is turning to you for ecclesiastical guidance in their entertainment. Nobody asked you to do that. Now, could be that you're volunteering for the position, that you feel compelled to do it out of a sense of duty or honor. Okay, cheers to you. I might be more willing to believe that if you weren't using every opportunity in these Bible thumping, holier than thou message fests to try and sell your books. I do these streams 1 or 2 days every week or two. I'm not on here trying to sell you something constantly. Not that I don't have shit to sell. A lot of these stories I share out for free because I'm more interested in having people enjoy the material and engage honestly with it. And even if they don't like it, they walk away and say, Josh, I didn't care for that. Okay. I took a shot. They didn't enjoy it. As is be. And more to the point, John De La Rose would agree with that position. I know because he said as much in the Discord interaction that he had a couple of weeks ago with a number of us, with me specifically, when I told him his book for Steaming Country was a steaming pile of shit. He said, well, sorry, sorry it wasn't for you. Everyone has different tastes. Funny, John. There's a lot of people who loved Kingdom Come Deliverance too. But you wanted to sit there and stand on your bully pulpit and growl and howl hellfire at them and say that it's a perverse game, that it's trash, that it's terrible because it's full of woke garbage and nonsense. Well, John, everybody, I guess it just wasn't for you. Everybody has different tastes, right? How is it okay for you to use that justification when you're told your stuff is garbage? But it's not okay for people who enjoyed the game to use that as their justification for why they enjoyed it? Seems a little disingenuous to me for you to sit there and say it's one way for everyone else, but for you it's different. Nah, I don't buy into that. The folks on the fringe left, the wokies, they've already been given a large number of warnings. Knock it the fuck off. We're going to stop buying your shit. And if your stuff still gets published or produced, we're going to start digging around and trying to find out how did it get paid for? Who paid for it? Who is insisting on this garbage being thrown out into the marketplace? Are we as taxpayers actually funding this shit? Because in some cases, we are. Look at Dustborn. Dig into that a little bit. You'll discover that there's a number of governmental grants that were given to the development studio behind Dustborn in order to fund a large portion of its development. Taxpayer funds. Not just from Sweden, where the game was made, but a portion of the funding came from the United States through the USAID and for the international development of arts. American taxpayer money could be pennies. I don't care. At the end of the day, a portion of our money, our taxpayer dollars, went into funding that absolute piece of propagandistic drivel. We paid for it. Only a little. But I don't remember being asked if I wanted to pay for that. Do you? No. None of us were asked about it. And when you start digging into who's funding these things, the folks on the fringe left wing of wokies in the media, in games media, they start howling and screaming and crying for blood and for your banishment and to have your commentary censored or yeeted off of YouTube altogether or removed from Twitter/X. They demand that you be silent, regardless of how much skullduggery you find. Folks on the other side of things, who are a little bit more in the conservative or right-leaning camp, nowadays, their perspective seems to be, fuck it, shine sunlight on all of it. Let's see it all play out. Because they're tired. They're tired of being lied to and manipulated and taken advantage of. They're tired of it. And they largely no longer believe the folks on that fringe left side whenever they open their mouths. And the folks slightly more to the right are saying, put up or shut up. If we don't like it, we're not paying for it. What are you going to do about it? Cry? Well, no. What they end up doing is trying to debank you, deperson you, demoralize you, and take all your shit, including your freedom. Seems a pretty hefty price to try and inflict on somebody just for saying, we've had enough of your shit. Go away. Seems an awfully heavy price. But that's enough for now. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.